Hey there, welcome to episode 16 of this Koala Sampler tutorial series, and in today's episode we're going to be talking about tips and tricks, anything that I think that I haven't covered between the other videos, and just some kind of like workflow tips, some kind of creativity tips, anything that I can think of. I'm going to kind of just sort of include in this video here, just to get you started and to give you some kind of tools to be sort of on your way in this kind of unique sort of sampling environment. As I said, it's a little bit different from working in a DAW, where you can just use like a bunch of plugins to get what you want. Here, if you want to build your beats inside of Koala without any other external sort of plugins or other apps, you need to start thinking a little bit more kind of creatively about how you put things together. So I'm going to start off by talking about layering samples. Now, I showed you in one of the other videos about kind of just moving your pads around your samples and duplicating and do all of that kind of thing. And what I showed you was that if we bring a sample over like this, we get the option to mix the two together. Now that's really useful. I'm just going to cancel this one on here because I don't want to do it just now. But to be able to just mix two pieces of audio on the one pad, and ultimately you can do that a sort of infinite number of times. I can just keep resampling into the same pad. That's how you can build some really interesting and kind of like creative sounds and effects. But I want to start with like some of the basics. So the basics being particularly drum sounds. You see this a lot. Sometimes if we look at like this kick drum here, got a really nice kind of low thuddy kind of sound. And then what I've got here is another kick drum that has a lot of high end in it. And you'll see people talking about kind of layering drums quite often in sort of hip-hop production, probably in all kinds of production. But this is a good way to sort of do it. Now, if you wanted to mix two together, that's kind of the sort of starting point, is you want to find two things that don't kind of conflict with each other, because there's no point in layering like two thuddy kicks together because you're just going to get like a bunch of low end. But if you like some of the sound of this one here, and you like a little bit of this one, you want to kind of create your own drum sound, then we can do that. Now, we could simply just drag this over, as I said, mix the two together, and that would be that. But actually, being creative in here, using the editing window, we can tailor these things a little bit more. So if we want just the thud from this kick here, let's come in and use our tone sort of EQ, and we can filter out a bunch of that high-end information. And we can decide where is enough, you know, that's your personal choice. But let's say I filtered out a little bit of that high end. Then on the high end kick here, I want to get rid of some of that sort of mid to low tones here, just because I don't want it to conflict too much. And I just want to combine the two. So again, I'm going to push this over this tone slider to the right. Just find enough of that sort of high to mid sound that I want. And then I can mix the two together. I've got my own completely unique sounding kick. Now, this technique applies to absolutely everything. So whatever it is you want to mix together, whether it's like a horn sample or a vocal sample, anything like that, we can just keep resampling and resampling and resampling. Now, the other thing to talk about while we're talking about sort of layers is doing some EQ filtering whilst layering samples up as well, because that can be really useful. So let's bring in something else as an example. I need something slightly more melodic for this. I'm just going to come all the way out here. I'm just going to go to some of the basic sounds that are included in Koala. There's usually a couple of things. Let's try melodic and see what we've got here. That will do. It's like a little Rhodes keyboard sample. And it's got a little bit of a sort of fade out, and then there's just a little bit of noise at the end here, where obviously it's kind of like when the key comes up. If we wanted to sort of make that smoother, like I discussed in one of the other episodes, I could take this when we were talking about attack and release. I can play along with the sort of release time here, give it quite a good release, and what that's going to do is it's going to fade that sample out before it gets to the very end. so we don't get that sort of harsh cutoff. Now, if I was going to build some kind of instrument here, or I wanted to play around with the piano roll, which again I showed you in another video, it's kind of cool to build some of these instruments and kind of layer some of these sounds. Now, let's say I wanted this to sound a bit more like a sample, a little bit kind of crustier. I could do some things. So I could come in here and I could use a little bit of tone, take some of the high end out. And maybe I want to add some kind of dust or some like crackle to this. If we go into our samples and search for some things, I believe in the sound effects here, we've got some noise. We've got some cassette noise, reel to reel, there's some vinyl static. Let's try the vinyl static. Yeah, that's a pretty authentic sounding vinyl static. So what I could do is I could layer this and mix these together so that I've created this kind of crusty sounding instrument. Now, the only thing you have to be aware of here is then your volumes. So like I said before, another tip and trick, I suppose, is that if you're going to start manipulating samples and you're concerned that you're not going to get it right the first time, it's always worth just keeping a backup of both of these. So I could take this one, put it over here, and this one just down here. You've got plenty of pads and plenty of space, so there's no reason to worry about that. But if I want to join the two together, let's just take a little listen to the volume here. And this, I would say I'd probably reduce the volume a little bit in here. And then what I can do is I can add to this. Now, the other thing that we can do before we do that is if we do bounce this audio here, watch how the wave file changes, because what the bounce does is it bakes in any effect changes that we make here to that sample. So if we go to Tools and then Bounce, you'll see now how the waveform has changed and it's got that nice soft tail at the end. Again, if I wanted to change this instrument and I wanted it to sound more maybe like a pad or something like that, I can come along and I can go to Attack and Release, and I could increase the attack so it's going to get a nice slow fade in as well. And you'll notice that if we undo this, after I bounce this down, our tone and attack and release had all gone back to normal because, of course, we've just baked this into the audio, so we have a second chance to start affecting things. So let's do that. Let's add a little attack at the beginning so it kind of fades in. And yeah, I want to bake that down again, so we're going to go back to Tools and bounce that. And again, you'll be able to see this fade in and fade out kind of happening in real time in your WAV file. And now I'm going to mix it in with this. So I'm just going to plonk this on top and I'm going to mix the two sample files together. And that way, now I can have a listen and kind of check my sort of audio levels and see what I think. And that's perfectly fine. Again, it's all going to come down to personal preference. You could be layering this with a vocal sample, you could be layering it with whatever. But I've created this kind of soft, not necessarily a pad, but it's like a sort of soft Rhodes with like a bit of vinyl crackle in there. And now when I bring that into something like this piano roll here, and let's take this into, let's do keyboard mode, and we'll keep it in chromatic. I'll just open this out a little bit. Come a little bit higher up the scale. I can now play this along. And because of the vinyl static noise that we put in the background, it starts to sound more like a sample. And as I say, that's just one, example of what you could do here. But layering your samples, I think, is really important. Layering drums is a technique that's been used for a long time. And it can add depth, it can add body to certain things. Another example of that, let's take another kick drum here. Let's go back and take kits. No, not kits. Let's take drum hits and some sort of kick drum. We'll take this lo-fi kick just as an example, even. say you bring in a drum loop or a kick drum, whatever it happens to be, and you would like to accentuate the low end or the high end of that, you can simply do the same by resampling onto a pad. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to clean up a little bit just so that the workspace doesn't get too messy. We've got these extras down here, but I don't need to save those now. That was just as an example. Let's bring our kick drum onto the first pad. So yeah, let's say I felt like this kick drum was lacking a little bit in the low end. I can make a duplicate of that kick drum, and then I'm going to keep them as they are, but I don't want to double up on my high end information. I only want to double up on the low end to give it a little bit more beef. Now, as I said, in a DAW, I could use a standard EQ, tweak the low end of that, and just, have it however I want it. Inside of Koala, you have to think a little bit differently, and it's the same with some of like the older MPCs. This is how the guys starting out with like the early MPCs would have had to do it. I know some of the newer ones now you can do EQ and all of that kind of thing, but this was kind of how they got some of those sounds and how they worked with the limitations that they had. So if we click edit here and do similar to what we did before, I just want to go in and I want to use the tone tool here, or the tone button if you like. And then if I filter it all the way down, so I'm literally only getting that like thuddy low end of the kick drum here, and then we mix that in with our original kick drum, we've just thickened up the low end here of this kick drum. And it's as simple as that. And of course that works the other way. If we got this one, we could take a duplicate of this one, for example. Then let's just take the high end. Let's say we wanted to put more high end and sort of more mid-range into this sample. Now, there's going to be certain limitations. Maybe the sample is like so lo-fi that it doesn't have any kind of high end to sort of register. But we can try it and see what happens. You can hear that. There's not too much in this one, but there's a bit. And we could do the same again. We just drag that on. We're layering the sample. We're going to mix it together. It probably does have a little bit more mid to high end information. So that's sort of like layering and also sort of like EQ filtering at the same time. I wanted to talk a little bit about those. And that kind of system applies to everything. You can do that to whole drum loops. I even do it to whole tracks. Sometimes if I get to the end and I've created a full beat, I will mix it all down into one wave file and then do exactly the same thing. I'll have maybe 2 or 3 copies of that wave file. If I feel like my overall mix is lacking in sort of high end, then I'll do the same. I'll just filter one down to just the high end, relayer that over the original like full track, and you've essentially added some high end to your track. It's a crude kind of way of working, but it's also quite clever. And as I said, working, even if you're going to go back to Ableton or your DAW and you're going to work there all the time, doing stuff like this just opens up your mind to different ways of like layering samples, being creative, and just, sort of doing other things with it. Another thing I want to talk about is sort of baking effects into samples. I think while we're doing that, we can probably do it with some of these kick drums. Now, I've just shown you that by using bounce. So let's say this kick drum here, do that again. If I bring the tone right down and then I do bounce, I bake the changes that we've made using these little features. Anything that we're editing down here, I'll bake that in. And we can do that with bounce. Now, there are other ways to do things because, of course, what we have sort of at our disposal is this whole effects rack over here. Now, the workflow is a little bit different, but it's definitely important to touch upon. So, I'll tell you what, maybe a snare drum will be a better example. Let's take a snare drum. That one will do. Got a nice little snare drum here. Just going to clean some of these out of the way as well. Plenty of high-end information. Again, if we wanted to do some simple editing here, take some of that high-end out, could do. Want to increase it, can do all of that here. But let's look at how we use our effects rack here to add even more sort of effects to our samples or loops, whatever it happens to be. We'll use this snare drum, for example. So in order to bake things in, there's a couple of ways to do it. If we have a sequence set up, let's create a sequence here. We're at 80 BPM. I'm going to get rid of this piano roll now because we're not using it. I'm just going to bring this right down to 1 bar so it's nice and simple. If I've got a sequence and my snares are kicking here and here, get the idea, can stop that. What you can do is resampling. Now, you can do resampling in a bunch of ways. Resampling the loop is going to resample your sequence loop. So if I do that now, what I've got, you can see here as we look at it, is our 80 BPM loop of just our snares. So bear that in mind. Resampling is very useful. And I'll show you how we can bake in those effects using that. So let's get rid of that one for a second. So now when we've got our snare drum here, let's say we want to add some effects to that and make it better, do whatever we want, but we want to use these effects in here. Using the hold feature, and I spoke about this in the effects video, we can press hold. If I wanted to run a little high end off of this, I can use my filter here. And we can press play and listen to our sample as it goes around, see what we want to do with it. Could add some bit crushing. Could add a little reverb. Or a lot of reverb. Go for a little bit. And then, of course, we could do some delay. That sounds pretty cool. And what we can do then is we can resample that loop with these effects turned on. And you will see now in this wave file that we got here, that it is. And if we went back to our sequence, we could then find where that is, which is on this second pad here, I think. We could get rid of these. We could bring in this sample, and then we'd need to pull this across the whole file here, or just have it and have it set in one-shot mode. But if we do it like that, now, you have to bear in mind when you're using things like delay on a short loop, it's gonna, if we look at the wave file, you can see that it's looped that delay from the end here and put it to the beginning. So it creates this like continuous loop. Keep that in mind. So that's one way of doing it. The other option that we've got when we want to play around with some of these effects and play with our samples is to do the resampling option or resample from the app. Now, in the user interface, I talked about where to find that, but it's in this little mic button here. If we set this to resample from app, whenever we record something, we take the audio from within the app. So I can press this, stop it. It's recorded that for me in here, and it's adjusted the start point. Very cool. So let's get rid of that. Again, we want to do the same thing. We want to be able to have our like effects on here. Let's try something different. Let's use, I don't know, let's play around with the pitch a little bit and then add a comb filter. I don't know, maybe a little bit of ring filter. Probably sound terrible, but I just need some different examples here. And there you go. We've suddenly turned our snare into this like kind of, it's almost like a spring reverb. So that's kind of cool. If we want to turn that into our thing that we can play around with, our next sample, then we can just hold this, do this, press it. And there we go. We've got 2 new snare drums that we could mess around with. And of course, we can go back and edit them. Maybe we only want this one. Maybe I want to pitch it down a little bit. We've just created this entirely new sound. And I think that's what sampling is all about, particularly in Koala, is getting your brain to work in a different mindset. Sure, you can just load up a bunch of wave files. You like the loops, you can bring them all in and sequence them. But for me, this is like the fun part, because you're going to create something that's totally unique. Something that is, yeah, it's going to be your track from start to finish. People will be asking you where you got the sample or whatever it is, because you spent the time to layer things up and be creative. And as I said, I could mix this in with this one if I wanted. Probably won't sound very good, but that is my option. And actually, you know, that's perfectly usable for something. Pitch it up. Whatever we want to do. Now, one thing to bear in mind, I don't know if those effects are still on. That is one thing to mention. If we turn those off, you need to just double check you're not doubling up on your effects here. When you do it this way via the pads and you resample from the app, if you've still got these effects turned on, it's going to be different. So if I play this now, yeah, you can hear there's less reverb and things going on, but that's kind of cool. That's a cool sound. And little things like this, sometimes a day just spent messing around, set yourself up a little folder and just start throwing all of these sounds in there. All of a sudden you've like made your own sample pack, all unique stuff. Really cool. So yeah, that's sort of like layering, some EQ filtering. Again, we can do EQ filtering inside of here. If you find that what you want doesn't come from using the tone here, you can also apply more filtering using the effects. So if we go back to, I don't know, let's take this loop just so that we got something that we can loop. Again, like a kind of crude EQ, if I just want the high end, can use the filter in here to do that, or more of just the low end information. And I can hold it, resample the loop, and there it is. Ready to use those sounds. One other thing I'll talk about, just while I've got it in my mind, is sometimes if I have like a drum loop, let's get a drum loop so I can demonstrate this. Let's go with, I'll have to find one somewhere else because I don't think I've got drum loops here. Let's go into this folder. Might take a second. Let's use a Beat Butcher drum loop. It'd be a good example. Find a break. Doesn't matter, let's pick this one. If we listen to this drum loop here, pretty dry. A lot of the time when I'm kind of making things with my beats, I like them to sound kind of like recorded in a studio. I like a little bit of reverb. Now, I could do the same thing that I've done here. I could load this into a sequence and have that play through and then apply some reverb. And if I just turn the reverb on and then play it for a second, you'll see what I mean. Where are we here? Let's play this. But what you'll find is that's kind of like too much of an effect. So the way you get around that is to, again, do some like baking in here. So let's set that. Let's just go back to samples. It doesn't actually tell me what the BPM of that is. I thought it did in there. I might use another break because I don't want to spend ages sorting that out. I'm going to go to my own sample pack. That'll be useful. And let's find one. I don't know if I've got anything that sounds particularly dry in here. Let's change tact. I've just realized that, of course, I'm kind of demonstrating what I like to do with my drums. So all of my drum samples in my drum pack already sound kind of like that. There's a lot of reverb and things in here. Let's quickly go back. I think I can use an AJ Hall break. Hopefully there's one in here that's kind of dry. That one will do. It's kind of the snare sound I'm sort of listening to. This is a particularly long loop, so let's start by editing that down. It's always good to kind of cover some old ground here. Let's turn the reverb off so that we can hear things properly. And I just want to bring this down to a very simple drum loop. So let's look for the start and end points. One shot. That should be a loop, I think, there. Yep, that will do us. Good enough. Let's crop this down. And I'm just going to normalize it as well to get a bit more volume. Again, let's tidy up our workspace. I don't need any of these things now. Just keeps it easier for me to see. I'm going to take 2 copies of this. Put this in here, and with the AJ Hall, that was what I was looking for, was that I want to know what the BPM is. So it was 84 BPM. We can go into our sequence here, set our BPM to 84 because that's what it is, find our first drum sample, and I think we had 2 bars there, I think, of that sample. So now I'm going to put that one in. I'm going to stretch it across the whole 2 bars and just make sure that's ready to play. So now we've got our loop here. I now want to create like a reverb version of this. So we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to go into our performance effects here, go into reverb and apply as much of that as we want. Now, sounds like overkill, but there's a reason and there's sort of method to my madness here. So let's go back into the sample. The other thing I don't want to affect is I don't want to affect the low end particularly. I don't really want my kicks to have so much reverb in them. I'm kind of mainly listening to that sort of high end sound. So when I go back to the sample before I do anything else, I'm actually going to use the tone tool again here and shift this up so that all I'm getting is like high end information. And again, we can just play that and listen to it. That sounds okay. And we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to resample this as a loop. Now we have this like reverb loop here. Again, just make sure that we don't still have any reverb or anything turned on. But what happens now is when we go back to our sequence, I can find this version of it. And I can layer that in. I can just make sure it's ready to play. Now when we play, we're going to get both of those together. Or let's just obviously go back to this one as well, because we need to make sure we turn this back to a normal sounding loop. And what I'll do with this pad is I'm going to turn the volume down on this first. Then we're going to play both together. And then slowly I can bring in the volume of just this like under reverb that's only attached itself to kind of like the high end. It's overkill if you turn it up too loud. But you get the idea. We can then dial that in. If I want to listen to just this, let's say I don't want the reverb for a second, so we can do kind of before and after, I can click mute and turn this off. Or I could click solo. And again, you'd have to dial it into your own taste. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. When it comes to like layering, filtering, doing this kind of sort of crude EQing, you can actually get some like surprising results, but you do have to think smart. You have to think about the idea, like what I was saying. I didn't want it to affect all of it. If I hadn't have done the editing to the original sample with the tone beforehand, it would have applied reverb to like the low end and the like the kick drum, and maybe that's what you want, but it is something to like think about. So I just want you to get that kind of thing into your like your sort of workflow and your mindset. Is just like thinking a little bit differently about how you can manipulate samples, EQ, filter, get the sort of sounds that you want. The other thing, let's talk about some of the other basics. What have I got? I've got a little list of things to go through here in this tips and tricks video. One of them is getting samples to mix together, because that's a sort of, you know, a very basic sampling technique. Let's go back in and find a couple of things. I'm going to go to my sample pack again, just because I know where everything is. And I'm going to take one of these melodic loops. Let's find something. Okay, let's take that summer loop. Sorry, the summer loop there, 64 BPM, just so that I can sort of sequence that out. So again, in here for our tempo, drag this. What's the quickest way to do it? We can do it that way, 64 BPM. Let's bring that sample in, which it's here. It's loaded up. Again, I can check my bar length because I put that in the sample itself. In the title here, summer loop is 4 bars. So let's create 4 bars inside of our sequence. I can double up. Now you'll notice when I double up, it copies the loop twice. It doesn't put the end point. We need to stretch it right the way across because we don't want it to sort of stop halfway through the loop and then start again. Keep an eye on that. And then when I press this, I'm just going to turn the volume down a little bit. And that's just going to play through as a loop. So pitching samples together, that's another way of like starting to build your tracks and flesh things out. And I've done it on some of my other videos, even for like Ableton. But if we take like a one shot of some kind, and I'll take one from somewhere else just to like keep switching things up a little bit. This might take a second. Let's go to, I know this Marco Polo has a bunch of like music chop things in here. Let's try a flute, for example. Something like that. Nice plain flute sound. So we've got a bunch of options for starting to layer these things together over our sample. Now, if we play our loop, doesn't fit together because it's not pitched correctly. So we can go into sample here, open up our editing window again, take a look at this one. And the quickest way that I would start is just start playing around with the pitch and see if I can get it to sound right there. And you could see as I went through the pitch there were like a few little options where that kind of suddenly became in sort of key with the sample. And the other way, of course, is to do this with the piano roll. So when we click our piano roll, again, there's a whole video just on the piano roll itself. I can now choose this sample to play through the keyboard here. And yeah, sometimes just triggering like one shot with like a little delay effect or something is enough to like flesh out the beat. But if we wanted to create some sort of melody over the top of this, we could do that. Maybe bring it down a little bit. Now, that's the thing you have to spend a little bit of time on. You need to work out what's in key, write a little melody. I'm not going to do all of that now. I just want to demonstrate that using either the pitch or using this piano roll is a good way to start turning your one-shots into instruments and to start layering your samples together. That's a real basic sort of, like sampling staple, is to layer samples and find little horns here or whatever it happens to be, and just kind of pitch those down and get them to fit in with your track. If you're, familiar with sampling, again, some of this is just going to be like absolute kind of beginner's information to you. But because I want this to be a very complete tutorial, I just want to go through as many of these things as I can because I feel like it's going to help somebody out if they're just starting. Or, maybe it's just something you hadn't thought of before. But that's another way of doing things, is sort of pitching things. What else have we got in our sort of tips and tricks folder here? What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some drum tips. So let's go here. Let's get rid of this. Clean up again. Let's get rid of you. And I'm just going to come here. We can probably use some of these drums because that'll make life easier. Let's start with a kick drum. That one will do. And you'll notice as we import samples as well, it's smart enough to just keep putting them in order, and it fills in gaps sometimes. Like if I had another sample here, for whatever reason I'd erased one, generally it's going to put it back here, like in the first gap. So it's quite clever like that. Then let's take like a hi-hat. load that in, and let's take a snare drum. Didn't realize that's got so much tail on it. Let's just take that like that. And this is what my first sort of like little kind of tip about the drums is going to be. So, like I've discussed before, we don't really have any visual sort of volume meters in here. Everything kind of has to be done by your ear, and sometimes that's okay, but maybe if you're trying to like mix something by headphones or you're not in the best environment, that's not always like super easy. So another tip that I've got is to use the resampling feature in here. You can also do it by sort of like resample by loop. So if we went in here and we made a drum loop as like a little sequence, let's take this down to 1 bar, and then got a kick. Let's just do super basic little kick here, kick, snare, snare, hi-hat. See, super basic stuff. We have some indication because of our waveforms here. You can see that this snare is like really loud. The kick drum could be louder, hi-hats, you know, sort of whatever volume it is. Some of the ways to kind of adjust that if you're struggling to do it by ear, another tip is, yeah, we can sort of listen to our drum volumes as they're kind of playing around in a loop. And I could just simply resample the loop for a second because it's a quick process. Go into edit here and check out the waveform. And yeah, I can see we got, you know, sort of mid-level kind of kick. Hi-hat's probably too loud. That snare is certainly too loud for me anyway, my sort of personal taste. I would change that. And so that allows us to adjust the volumes and see visually what's happening. So if we just say, okay, there's the snare drum, let's make this, you know, a good bit less in volume. Want the hi-hats to be a little less as well. And it's a little trial and error. If I want to like increase my kick volume, if I see I've got a little bit of headroom in the kick here, I could normalize this, get a little bit more out of it. And again, I can just resample the loop because it's all set up as a sequence. Check out this now. Definitely more balanced. And again, I'm not going to spend hours just tweaking these here for this example, but you can definitely see how we can start to use our waveform as just some kind of like visual representation of like audio levels. And you can do that for any kind of sample. I find I do it a lot for drums because, yeah, sometimes it's just really hard to tell if you're like mixing in headphones, like exactly where the volumes are. You find like a lot of old breaks. The more you kind of study like other drum patterns and stuff like that, most old breaks, the kick drums tends to be slightly lower than the snare drum. But of course, you know, you're making whatever modern boom bap or whatever, you might want your kick drum to be the strongest thing in the whole mix. Or personal preference, but I wanted to talk a little bit about how you can do that. Another quick way, if you don't want to do the resampling loop here and you just want to do it from your pads, and another good way of like sort of creating drum breaks, if you want like a more off-the-grid fluid kind of feel, would be to keep resample from app on. Then when I do recording and hold recording here, I can just play my drum loop. And I've now got the drum loop in here. One, I can visually see, again, my sort of, you know, volumes here. And two, if I just want to create, yeah, a kind of off-the-grid sort of drum loop, I can just find the end of wherever that is, wherever I want it. I can set this into one shot and loop. And that's how you get some things like that. Again, I've been through that before, but if you've got something and you want to trim out like the silence or do whatever, like if I take this and we crop it down from there, got a bunch of silence at the beginning that I don't need, I can use the tools here and do trim silence. and it's trimmed my loop right up nicely there. So again, just little tips, little things that are good to kind of keep in the back of your mind. So yeah, that's resampling that way. What else have we got that I can show you? I want to talk a little bit about sequencing with drums, so it's kind of useful that we've got this set up in here. And again, there's a whole video just on sequencing, but some little tips for just kind of like if you're doing more sort of like you want more natural kind of feel to your drums and stuff. Working off the grid is like a big thing. I work off the grid with drums, with kind of any sort of sample. If you always use quantize and you snap to everything, you just don't get really a lot of kind of like soul and sort of rhythm to things. So usually I come in and I tweak things. It doesn't have to be big tweaks, but I could move my like snares slightly forward of the grid, or I could move them behind and make them a little bit lazy. These hi-hats, I could do the same sort of thing. Just pull them ever so slightly out of line. This kick drum, if I want it to be, I don't know, again, just slightly off of that grid. We could maybe put another one in here somewhere. And play around, because you've got this sequence to play around with it when we press play here. You can play around with them while this is sort of looping round. And yeah, just kind of get like a little bit of a better feel. Off the grid is definitely important. While we're talking about off the grid, and I've got it in my mind, if we just close this out for a second, I don't think I've touched on this. I've shown you where the swing feature is, but let's play the drum loop and apply some swing so you can see what it does. Now we'll have to add a few more drums in here, and that's mainly because it has to be there has to be a certain amount of drums at certain spots on the grid in order for swing to really kind of take effect. Let's put in another kick drum here. In fact, maybe if I snap everything back to the grid and then show you it that way. Let's do this and snap, and you'll see everything tidies back to the grid. Let's try it like that. So you can hear that it's not very pretty when everything's sort of snapped to the grid. Sounds pretty terrible. Let's add a little swing. And essentially the swing is kind of doing what I was sort of doing manually, where you're starting to pull things off of the grid a little bit. You can kind of hear it mainly in this sort of last kick drum that comes in here. If you listen to the difference before it's on and when it's off, so we've got it on now. Turn it off. It just lacks that like swing feel. It's very like static, very quantized, not very nice. So yeah, that's another tip. Try working off the grid a lot more, particularly for like hip hop stuff. It doesn't matter actually, you know, you could make house music and keep it off the grid. But you know, that's kind of a tip there. The other one is to take advantage of the velocity, because again, everything in here, it's all kicking at the same tone. I just want to see if I've left the swing on. Going to keep the swing on just because it sounds nicer. But if we go back to our little sequence window here, go into velocity. I'm going to say like when this second kick drum comes in here, I would bring this one down a little bit. It doesn't have to be so low, but I just want, again, like a natural feel. So like when a drummer's playing, every hit they make is not going to be exact. They're not machines. So the same with like your velocity here. We could have this one a little lower. I don't know. We can even make it sort of like go up and down in kind of like a pattern if you want. But I just kind of like to randomize things a little bit so you just get some like variation. Take that down a bit. And even with swing on, we can still move things around. If we just want to get like a slightly different sound, you need to be in brush mode, of course. you get the idea of what I'm saying. Be more creative with your velocity and keeping things off the grid. You're going to get better sounding drums. It's just going to sound a lot more kind of pleasing to the ear. Definitely take advantage of the swing in here. Depending on the pattern that you got, maybe if you got like a lot more hi-hats in and other layers, you'll hear more of this swing effect as you play around with it. You can also experiment with what it sounds like to have like 3 beats per bar or 4, 2 beats per bar, whatever. Play around with some of those options. Try and get creative with it. What have we got next? So we've done pitching, we've done baking effects. You'll have to excuse me because I'm reading from a list. This one particular episode for this video, I knew there was kind of a lot to go over, so I just wanted to write down a few things so that I could remember. I've talked about resampling in the sense of that we can just resample this loop. So if you want to play this drum loop, of course, nice and slow. Let's shift the tempo up a little bit, super slow. Have it like that. So now resampling is useful for doing what I said before. We can kind of bake in our effects, we can filter things down and then bake all of that in. But the other reason resampling is useful is simply to save space and to make life easier when you're working. So let's say you're happy with this, you've got all your drum levels just where you want them, and you want to kind of save some space here, because once you've got a sequence like this, you have access to 64 pads worth of information. I could build a track and have all of this separate and then add 18 layers of samples and whatever the hell else I want to put in there. You could end up with like these really complex little sequences that can be hard to manage, and I think a lot of the time it is definitely about sort of being like working smarter and not harder. So let's say that is my drum pattern, I'm super happy with it. I can just resample my loop again, and now my drums are all here, completely baked in just as I want them. And if we go in here and just, again, quickly delete everything that we don't need, bring that to our first pad here. When I go into my sequence, it saves all of this information, but again, holding down and then just dragging along. Whoops, let's do that again. Let's take all of it, hit delete. Now I've just got one row of information at the top that is all of my drums. And if we were struggling with like memory space or anything like that, you're having performance issues, what I've done is I've taken 3 pads worth of information and baked it down to 1 pad. So keep that in mind as well. It's also important when it comes to mixing. That's another tip I'll give you, is that when I mix something, if I've got, say, my drums, bass, within like a melody, perhaps I've got like some horn samples, I've got flute, I've got X amount of things all stacked up and layered in here. Generally what I try and do is I group everything down to like one loop, like I've just done with the drums here. I want to bake my drums, I want to bake a bass line in, and then everything else, if I can get away with it, as long as I feel it's balanced pretty well, I will bake all of that down. Because when it comes to mixing, do I want to mix 18 different things, or do I just want to mix like the 3 basics? Because when it comes to like particularly hip-hop stuff, that's going to be the kind of the main thing you're focused on. Where is my main sort of loop and melody? What's the bass line like in sort of what's the word I'm looking for, in relation to the kick drum and the drums and the thing. And the more you can bake down, aside from the fact that it just makes your sequences like cleaner and easier to manage, it just gives you a lot less headaches. You're only mixing 3 things instead of mixing 20. So keep that in mind as well as like a little tip. What else can I show you that we've got in here? We've done that with sequences. Again, going sort of back the way a little bit. If I want to bake some effects into this, again, I can do so. So I could play my drums here. Sometimes you just need to tap the sample. If it doesn't start when you're playing your loop, just tap the sample to make sure it kicks on. If I want to add some effects to these, beef them up a little bit, I could come in and do that. I could put some bit crushing on here to just kind of distort them a touch. Add a little bit of this dirty saturation. It's kind of saturation distortion. Add a little compression in here. and then resample again, bake everything down to that loop. So yeah, whether it's just one sample or multiple samples, drum loops, keep that like resampling thing in mind, because now we've got 2 versions. And of course, if you keep the 2 versions and you get to like the end of a mix, I can always say, well, what does it sound with like the clean drums and what does it sound like with the dirty drums? And then you've got like even more options as you kind of go through. Baking things down, yeah, it's definitely good for saving like space. It will help you out in the long run. You're not going to end up with like, 8 million files and a bunch of pads. And I've said a few times throughout the video series, I rarely get past using like 1 page of pads just to make a beat. Because I'm doing that, I'm constantly layering, coming back in, editing things and baking things down just to completely make my life easier. I don't want to spend time putting distortion on every kick drum, every hi-hat, every snare, when I can just apply it to the whole group. So yeah, that's a good one for that. We've done checking your volumes, mixing less. One-shot instruments, I kind of covered at the beginning. Let's talk about that a little bit more. So let's just move these to the beginning, to the bin even. And then let's pick something else as an instrument. What have we got? Music chops. Yeah, little horn sample here. The other thing I wanted to talk about with these sort of one-shot instruments is using velocity to give you like nice variations. So if we go into sequencing here, and let's say we got this horn and we want that to play, let's give ourselves 4 bars like this. And the horn's going to kick in every bar, say. So we can have it do that. Now, in order to kind of be, sort of more creative with it, rather than just having this hit at the same volume and same pitch every time, we can do some other things. Actually, what I need to do there, just be very careful. If you've turned snap off, just turn it back on if you're trying to lock things to the grid again, because it does just put them wherever your like finger landed. Let's say we make it like this. Also, I need to turn snap to the end back on because I want to snap it to a certain point. Let's do it more like that. And then when we play like this is a one shot. You can go in and just double check that. Yeah. Again, use your velocity to kind of create some variation here. Now we can use pitch as well, because of course we could play this like an instrument. So I could open the piano roll and choose this one, and then we could do all of that. Super fun. But just bear in mind like what velocity does here. So let's say we're going to start a little bit of a loop. Might need to be quicker, but for this example, this should be fine. I can make this next one a little bit quieter, this one a little bit quieter still, and this one a bit quieter still. And now what we get, instead of just, 4 like horn stabs coming through, we've got this nice little fade out. Just sounds a lot better. Again, let's add some effects in here. Let's do hold and tempo delay. And again, if we just wanted to do some like simple editing to play around with our sample here, I could come along, go into attack, and remember our attack is like our fade in. You just get that nice fade out. Yeah, I think one-shot instruments are like super useful, but again, try and be creative with what you do with them. We could bring another one in here. I could duplicate this, for example, onto the next pad. I could pitch this one. Sounds kind of cool, pitched up by like one semitone there. Then I could go to the sequence and I could add in, yeah, something else here. So we could do them here. And the same with like the velocity. We could just bring it down and down and down, right down here like this. And while we're here, if we wanted to add any more effects, we could do. This vibraflange is kind of like that sort of, yeah, tape wobble effect. Maybe up the delay a bit more. Try a bit less. Talk box. And of course, we can just resample all of that down into one loop. And now we've got this. Just make sure our effects are off. That can then go into a folder. And yeah, it's essentially like your own created a little one shot. That then I could pitch into another song, into another track. Play around with it even further. I think you get the idea for what I'm saying. And I feel like this video has probably been sort of long enough there. Remember, again, the mutant solos. I'll just talk about that very quickly. When you are trying to like bake something in and you want to kind of play around with like your layering and your samples, you can use mutant solo to do that as well. Let's say in our sequence, we've got both of these playing. But I actually only want to hear one of them before I bake it down. I can choose to mute one or solo one. Then when I resample, I'm only getting that side, the one that we soloed, which was kind of like the second horn sort of stab that we've got there. So yeah, other than that, I think I'm going to sign off. And yeah, I will catch you guys in the next video. Hope you've enjoyed it. Hope you've learned something. Take care, and I'll see you then.